Hello. Today's little reflection is, wait, what was parable again? Because we use this word parable all the time in the church, and personally, I don't ever really hear the word parable except in the context of the Bible. And so we're just revisiting it as part of reflecting on this week's parable, which is the weed and the weeds. The wheat and the weeds. While the parables in the Bible aren't the only parables that exist in literature, they are by far and away the most famous examples of this figure of speech. So what's translated in our Bible as parable, Greek meaning throwing alongside, was probably the Hebrew word mashal, which was used for an illustrative figure of speech, but quite a nebulous way, not making the same distinctions which we're prone to making today. Part of our problem with really deeply understanding Jesus' use of parables is the heritage of our Western cultural snobbery about philosophy and therefore theology. While we might not be conscious of it, we exist in a space where there's supposedly this logical, objective argument that exists, and that's privileged above other ways of knowing and other ways of sharing wisdom. And as Australians, it's particularly important to notice this in the ways that traditional Indigenous knowledge and teaching is so often ignored and minimised in our culture. It's relevant here to realise that the church has often looked on the parables of Jesus as simple stories for simple folks, that he had to dumb down the proper theology for the fishermen and the carpenters. That's nothing but cultural snobbery. Jesus knew what he was doing, and his teaching in parables was a venerable and sophisticated technique in the Semitic world in which he lived. In the words of Kenneth Bailey, who's a biblical scholar who lived a life immersed in Middle Eastern cultures, he said, "A parable is an extended metaphor, and as such it's not a delivery system for an idea, but a house in which the reader or listener is invited to take up residence. That person is urged by the parable to look on the world through the windows of that residence." It's important to realise the difference between allegory and parable, a distinction that's made more difficult for us by the way in which for centuries the church conflated the two. And indeed, in the passage for this week, the wheat and the weeds, it's thought that the explanation of the parable, which sort of transforms it into allegory, were not the words of Jesus himself, but instead added by a very early source, either the evangelist or another. And that's not done in bad faith. Indeed, as with many oppressed people, it may have helped the early church using allegory to have an internal code not understood by those who sought to destroy them. But that allegorical tendency was taken too far. Allegory is one of that one-to-one equivalence. You may be familiar perhaps with the, to my mind, very heavy-handed John Bunyan's The Pilgrim's Progress, or more to my taste, George Orwell's Animal Farm. But instead of that one-to-one equivalence, parable is able to convey to us a constellation of meaning. And of course, I've spoken before about how a parable can offer fresh insight on each rereading. Another difference is that one of the ways this way of teaching works is by being surprising or having outlandish elements, and you can see parallels there with certain Eastern ways of teaching. That surprise is part of what startles the listener into deeper reflection. Unfortunately, because they are within our scriptures, our deep familiarity with these parables, and of course our different cultural context to that in which Jesus lived, can often blind us to what is meant to be surprising and unsettling in these stories. Why does it matter? What possible difference can it mean? What is a parable or what isn't? I think we're freed from the rigidity of just accepting the received allegorical schema, and that freedom allows us to seek other meaning. Kenneth Bailey, that scholar of the Middle East, said, a parable challenges the listener in ways that abstract statements of truth do not. I think perhaps the challenge for me in looking, living with these parables is to keep checking in with my cultural prejudices, which absolutely formed my intellectual landscape, and instead to learn to sit in the ambiguity and the not knowing, and also to be open to receiving wisdom from unexpected sources. I hope that wisdom is able to find you wherever you find yourself this week. Goodbye and God bless.